The year was 1884, and the land held its breath under a sky the color of a faded bruise. For Elias Vance, the world had shrunk to the size of his homestead, a small, lonely island carved from the vast, indifferent prairie of the Dakota Territory. The silence in his cabin was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on him, thick with the ghosts of laughter and a small voice calling for its father. It had been 2 winters since diphtheria had stolen his wife, Hannah, and their son, Thomas, leaving Elias a hollowed-out man, tending the embers of a life that had already burned to ash. His days were a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival that asked for nothing but muscle and sweat, and for that he was grateful. He chopped wood until his arms screamed, the sharp crack of the axe a welcome intrusion into the quiet. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness. He spoke only to his mule, a creature whose dumb patience felt like a form of companionship. He was a man living in the past tense, his heart a locked room, the key long since lost in the cold earth beside 2 simple wooden crosses on a nearby hill. The nearby town of Redemption Creek was a place he avoided whenever possible. It was a raw settlement of dirt streets and false-fronted buildings that baked in the summer and froze in the winter, populated by people whose piety was as thin as their walls. They were suspicious of strangers, and doubly so of a man who preferred his own company. They looked at Elias with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing his grief not as a wound but as a weakness, a failure to simply move on. They whispered about him, the widower on the edge of the prairie, a man who had forgotten how to speak to his own kind. He felt their judgment like a change in the weather, a cold front moving in whenever he rode down the main street for salt, flour, or coffee. On one such trip, with the autumn air carrying a sharp, biting promise of the harshness to come, Elias found the town's usual grumbling quiet, replaced by a tense, expectant hum. A crowd had gathered in the dusty square before the sheriff's office, their faces a grim tableau of cruel curiosity and nervous excitement. At the center of the gathering, tied to the thick hitching post usually reserved for unruly horses, was a woman. She was young, Lakota, with hair as black as a raven's wing and a face carved from proud defiance. Her hands were bound tight to the wood, her chin held high, though a tremor ran through her slender frame. Sheriff Callahan, a man whose authority was inflated by his own self-importance, stood before her, unrolling a long black leather whip. "This is what happens to thieves in Redemption Creek," he boomed, his voice slick with righteousness. This woman, caught red-handed trying to steal a bolt of calico from Mr. Donovan's mercantile. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elias watched from the edge, his hand resting on his mule's neck. He had seen the woman in town before, trading beaded crafts for necessities. He had also seen the way Mr. Donovan watched the native folk who entered his store, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, his hands never far from the shotgun he kept beneath the counter. Elias knew a lie when he heard one, and the sheriff's proclamation stank of it. The woman said nothing. Her silence was more powerful than any denial. It was a wall of dignity against which their accusations broke and fell away. "The punishment," Callahan declared, savoring the moment, "is 50 lashes, to serve as a lesson." 50 lashes. The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It was a death sentence for a woman of her size. He had seen men broken by 20, their backs turned into a raw, bloody ruin. A cold horror washed over him, momentarily eclipsing the dull ache of his own grief. He saw the faces in the crowd, the leering, the indifferent, the few who looked down at their feet, ashamed but unwilling to act. He saw the whip in Callahan's hand, a coiled serpent ready to strike. And then he saw Hannah. He saw her in the final days, her body frail, her breath a ragged whisper, helpless against the fever that consumed her. He remembered the crushing impotence he had felt, the rage at a world that would let such goodness be extinguished without a fight. He had been powerless then, but he was not powerless now. Something inside him, a part he thought long dead, broke free from its cage of sorrow. Before he had consciously decided to move, his boots were crunching in the dust, carrying him through the parted crowd. He stopped a few feet from the sheriff, his shadow falling over the bound woman. The townspeople fell silent, their attention shifting to this unexpected interruption. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse but steady. Callahan turned, his face tightening with irritation. "Vance, this ain't your concern. Go on home." "I'll take it," Elias said. The words hung in the air, stark and unbelievable. Callahan blinked. "Take what?" "The punishment," Elias clarified, his gaze unwavering. "I'll take her lashes." A wave of stunned disbelief rippled through the crowd. The woman at the post twisted her head, her dark eyes wide with shock, searching his face. For the first time her composure seemed to crack, replaced by a profound confusion. Why would this stranger, this white man, do such a thing? Sheriff Callahan let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You've been out in the sun too long, Vance. Are you insane? Why in God's name would you do that for her?" He gestured dismissively at the woman. Elias didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the sheriff. He couldn't explain the storm of memory and rage inside him. He couldn't articulate the sudden, fierce need to stand against this casual cruelty, to do the one thing he could not do for his own family, to shield another from a fate they did not deserve. So he gave the only answer that made sense. She didn't do it. "I'm the law here, and I say she did," Callahan snarled, his face reddening. "Now get out of the way." "Let her go," Elias said, his voice dropping low. "And I'll take the 50, publicly, here and now. You'll still have your spectacle." The sheriff hesitated. The crowd was murmuring, their mood shifting from bloodlust to fascination. This was a better show than they could have hoped for. A madman defending an Indian. It was unheard of. Callahan saw the opportunity. Humiliating the grieving widower would be a far more potent lesson to any other would-be dissenters than simply whipping a native woman nobody cared about. "Fine," he spat, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Have it your way. Let it be known that Elias Vance values a savage's life over his own skin." He nodded to his deputy. "Cut her loose." The deputy, a young man with nervous eyes, quickly sawed through the woman's ropes. She stumbled forward, rubbing her wrists, her gaze locked on Elias. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a signal to go. She hesitated for a moment, a universe of questions in her eyes, before melting back into the crowd and disappearing. Elias turned and faced the post. He unbuttoned his shirt, his hands moving with a calm he did not feel, and shrugged it off, letting it fall into the dust. He placed his hands on the rough wood, his back bare to the expectant town. The sun felt hot on his skin. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, a crawling, prurient gaze. He closed his own, and for a moment the world was just the memory of Hannah's hand in his. The first lash was a line of pure fire, tearing across his shoulders. A gasp escaped his lips, choked off before it could become a cry. The crowd roared its approval. The second lash landed lower, crossing the first. The pain was blinding, absolute. It seared through flesh and muscle, a white-hot agony that erased all thought. He clenched his jaw, tasting blood where he bit his tongue. He lost count. The world became a cycle of searing pain, the whistle of the leather through the air, and the sickening impact. The roars of the crowd began to fade, replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence as the reality of the punishment unfolded. This was not a show anymore. This was a man being methodically flayed. He focused on the grain of the wood under his palms, on the rhythm of his own ragged breathing. He would not scream. He would not give them that. At some point, the pain became a distant, roaring ocean. His knees buckled, but he forced them straight. His vision swam in a red haze. He felt a presence nearby, heard a voice raised in anger. "That's enough, Callahan. You'll kill him." It was Dr. Amos Blackwood, his voice a sharp scalpel cutting through the thick silence. The whipping stopped. The sudden absence of pain was as disorienting as the blows themselves. Elias's hand slid down the post, and the world tilted, dissolving into blackness. He collapsed into the dust, a broken heap at the foot of the town's cruel justice. His return to consciousness was slow and agonizing. He was aware of a jolting motion, of a rough blanket beneath him, of a voice murmuring nearby. He was in the back of a wagon. Dr. Blackwood was there, steering the horses, his face a grim mask of fury. "Fools, a town of bloodthirsty fools," the doctor muttered, more to himself than to Elias. "Hold on, son, I'm taking you home." The journey was a blur of misery. Every rut and rock in the road sent fresh waves of agony through his back. By the time they reached his cabin, Elias was slick with sweat and shivering, on the edge of passing out again. The doctor, a surprisingly strong man for his age, managed to get him inside and onto his cot, face down. "This is going to hurt," Amos said, his voice gentle now, "but we have to clean it, or the infection will take you for sure." Elias gritted his teeth as the doctor worked, cleaning the horrific lattice of wounds with carbolic acid and water. The sting was a new and vicious torment. Afterward, Amos applied a thick, greasy salve that smelled of pine and herbs and bandaged him as best he could. "I'll leave the rest of this here," the doctor said, placing the jar on the small table. "Apply it twice a day. Boil any water you drink, and for God's sake, stay put." He looked at Elias, his expression a mixture of admiration and profound concern. "That was the bravest and most foolish thing I have ever witnessed, Elias. I don't know what possessed you." Elias couldn't answer. He could only manage a faint nod. The doctor left, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Elias lay in the dim light of his cabin, adrift in a sea of pain, his body a single screaming nerve. Fever began to creep in at the edges of his awareness, bringing with it distorted dreams of whips and winter snows. He was utterly alone, more vulnerable than he had ever been. Or so he thought. Sometime in the deep of the next day, through the haze of fever, he became aware of a presence. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a change in the air of the room. A floorboard creaked softly. The scent of wood smoke, freshly kindled, cut through the stale air. He tried to lift his head, but a wave of dizziness and pain forced him back down. He must have drifted off, because when he woke again, a cup of water was on the floor beside his cot, within reach. The fire in the hearth was burning low and steady, warding off the chill. He drank, the cool liquid a blessing on his parched throat. He was not alone. Over the next few days, this silent pattern continued. He would wake from pained, feverish sleep to find the fire tended, a small bowl of thin broth on the table, and his water bucket refilled. Once, in a moment of greater lucidity, he saw her. It was the Lakota woman from the town square. She moved with a quiet, ghost-like grace, her face impassive. She saw that he was awake, her dark eyes meeting his for a heartbeat before she turned and slipped out the door. She never spoke. She never approached him directly while he was conscious. But when the fever was high and his mind was clouded, he felt gentle hands cleaning his wounds, replacing the bandages with fresh ones coated in the doctor's salve and something else cooler, greener-smelling poultice of crushed leaves that seemed to draw the fire out of his skin. He existed in a state of confusion and suspicion. Why was she here? Was it pity? Gratitude? He was too weak to ask, too weak to protest. He was at her mercy, a thought that sat uneasily with him. But her care was undeniable. It was methodical, impersonal, and it was keeping him alive. The fever slowly began to recede, leaving him weak and drained, but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. One morning, the light slanting through his window felt different, brighter. The pain in his back had subsided to a deep, throbbing ache. He managed to push himself up onto his elbows, his muscles protesting with every inch. He looked towards the door, expecting to see it empty. It was not. Standing just outside the open doorway, bathed in the morning sun, were 7 women. The woman he knew, the one who had been caring for him, stood slightly in front. Behind her were 6 others, ranging in age from a girl not much older than his Hannah to an elder whose face was a beautiful map of wrinkles. They were all dressed in traditional buckskin, their expressions serene and unreadable. They just stood there watching him, their stillness as profound as the prairie itself. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Fear, sharp and primal, shot through him. Was this a trap? Was he about to pay a different price for his interference? He tried to push himself up further, a useless, defensive gesture. The woman he now thought of as his silent nurse took a step forward, holding up a hand as if to calm him. "Do not be afraid," she said. Her voice was low and clear, her English careful and precise. It was the first time he had heard her speak. "We have not come to harm you." Elias sank back onto his elbows, breathing heavily. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Winona," she said. "These are my mother, my aunts, and my sisters. We have come to speak with you." An older woman, the one with the wise, creased face, stepped forward to stand beside Winona. She looked at Elias, her eyes holding a deep, ancient knowing. She spoke in the Lakota tongue, her voice a soft, rhythmic cadence. Winona listened, then translated. "My mother, Istas, says that you have done a thing that has no name in your language. You, a white man, took the whip for one of our people. You took her shame and her pain and made it your own. You did this in the sight of your enemies and ours. This is an act of honor that shakes the foundation of the world we know." Elias stared at them, completely at a loss. I only did what I thought was right." "What is right for your people is to watch us suffer," Winona said, a flicker of old bitterness in her eyes before it was gone. "What you did was not right. It was sacred. You have created a great imbalance, a debt of the spirit." "I don't want anything," Elias insisted, shaking his head. "I want no payment. I need nothing from you." Winona shared a look with her mother. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what came next. "It is not about what you want. It is about what must be. A debt like this cannot be left unpaid. It would bring misfortune to us all. An act of such profound kinship must be answered with kinship. An act of family must be answered by making family." She paused, her gaze direct and unflinching. "My people have talked. My family has decided. We have come to honor you in the only way that can balance this debt. We have come to offer you a wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Elias felt as if the air had been punched from his lungs. A wife? He looked from Winona to the other silent women, their faces solemn and serious. This was no trick. This was a formal, deadly earnest proposal. You want me to marry one of you?" he stammered, his mind reeling. "No," Winona said softly, and for the first time she looked down at the floor. "They offer me to be your wife, to bind your house to my family, to care for the man who saved my life and my honor." Elias pushed himself to a sitting position, ignoring the fire that ripped across his back. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, his bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. He was dizzy, weak, and utterly overwhelmed. "No," he said, the word coming out as a harsh croak. "Absolutely not, I can't." The women's faces did not change, but he felt a shift in the room, a tension. "I am grateful for the care you've given me, Winona," he said, trying to make them understand. "More grateful than I can say, but I cannot marry you. I'm not a husband, not anymore." He gestured vaguely around the empty cabin, a space defined by loss. "My wife, my son, they are gone. The man I was died with them. What is left is not enough for anyone." He looked at Winona, pleading with his eyes. "I did not do what I did to get a reward. I did it because I couldn't stand by and watch. That's all. There is no debt." Winona listened, her expression softening with a hint of understanding, or perhaps pity. She spoke to her mother again in Lakota. The old woman listened, then responded at length. "My mother says you speak of your heart's sorrow," Winona translated, her eyes meeting his again. "We understand sorrow. My husband and my son were lost in the ghost winter, taken by the coughing sickness. My family knows the shape of an empty space in the home." The revelation stunned Elias into silence. She too was a survivor of a devastation he knew all too well. He looked at her not as a stranger, a representative of a foreign custom, but as a fellow traveler in the barren lands of grief. "She says," Winona continued, "that your spirit is wounded, just as your back is wounded. She says that a person cannot heal alone. It is not our way. You took my physical pain. Now, it is my place to help carry your spiritual pain. This is the balance. Marriage is the name we give it. It means I will stay. I will tend your fire. I will share your work. We will be a family against the wilderness. It does not mean you must forget your lost ones. It means you will not be lost with them." Before Elias could form a reply, the sound of hoofbeats and the rattle of a wagon shattered the morning quiet. A voice boomed from outside. "Vance, I know you're in there, and I know you've got squatters with you." It was Sheriff Callahan. Instantly, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The women, who had been serene and calm, became tense, their bodies coiled with a defensive stillness. Winona moved to the side of the doorway, peering out cautiously. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. Callahan had come to his home, to this place of quiet convalescence, to continue his campaign of petty tyranny. "Stay inside," Elias commanded in a low voice. Using the wall for support, he pulled himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest. The pain in his back was a sickening, grinding fire. He swayed for a moment, his vision tunneling, but he forced himself to stay upright. He grabbed the hickory walking stick the doctor had left him and limped towards the door. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. Sheriff Callahan sat on his horse, a rifle resting across his saddle. His deputy was with him, looking even more nervous than he had in the town square. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice tight, "this is private property." "Not when it's being used to harbor vagrants," Callahan retorted, gesturing with his rifle toward the silent women who had gathered behind Elias in the doorway. "I'm giving you one chance, Vance. Send them packing, or I'll arrest the whole lot of them for trespassing, and you for harboring them." Elias looked back at Winona, at her mother, at the faces of the women who had come to offer him an honor he couldn't comprehend. He saw their quiet pride, their unshakable resolve. And he saw the sheriff, a man who built his power on fear and prejudice. In that moment, the choice became startlingly clear. His grief had isolated him, made him a passive observer of his own life. But the whip, and now this confrontation, had awakened something else, a duty, an allegiance. He turned back to Callahan, planting the end of his walking stick firmly in the dirt. He stood taller, the pain a distant thing now, burned away by resolve. "They are not vagrants," Elias said, his voice ringing with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "They are my guests. And this woman," he glanced back at Winona, meeting her wide, astonished eyes, "is under my protection." He took a half step to the side, positioning himself more fully between the sheriff and the women. It was a small movement, but it was a declaration. He was no longer just a man who had taken a whipping. He was a man who had chosen a side. Callahan's face darkened with rage. He had expected a broken, cowed man. He found a defiant one. "Is that so? You're choosing them over your own kind?" "They've shown me more kindness than my—" The year was 1878, and the world for Elias Blackwood had shrunk to the size of his smithy. It was a world of soot and sweat, of fire and iron, a place where the only reliable conversation was the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil. His forge stood at the frayed edge of Providence, a town that clung to the vast, unforgiving prairie like a nervous hand gripping a knife. Beyond the town, the land rolled on into territory that belonged to the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the 5 other tribes of the Confederation, fact that kept the residents of Providence in a perpetual state of low-grade fear. Elias preferred the fear of the known wilderness to the suffocating judgment within the town's dusty streets. Grief had been the architect of his isolation. It had built the walls around his heart higher and thicker than any fortress. Years ago, before the war had carved a limp into his leg and a permanent winter into his soul, there had been Clara, there had been a son, little Samuel. A fever, swift and merciless, had taken them both, leaving behind a silence so profound that Elias had fled into the noise of the army, hoping to hammer the memories out of his head. The war had only added new ghosts to the ones he already carried. Now, his life was a metronome of routine. Rise at dawn, light the forge, heat the iron, shape it, quench it, and start again. It was a penance and a refuge, a way to pass the days without having to truly live them. The people of Providence saw him as a surly recluse, a man with embers in his eyes and a past he never spoke of. They brought him their broken plowshares and dull axe heads, paid their coin, and left him to his solitude. They didn't see the way his hand would sometimes pause over the forge, his mind lost in the image of a small hand clutching his finger. They didn't understand that the ferocious heat he commanded was the only warmth he had left. His strength was a shell, his skill a distraction. He was a man hollowed out, living a life of quiet resignation, waiting for an end he was too stubborn to seek himself. The storm arrived as dusk was bleeding into night, a bruise of purple and grey spreading across the sky. The wind howled like a thing grieving, rattling the loose boards of the smithy and driving stinging rain against the wide-open doors. Elias was banking the forge, the glow painting his worn face in shades of orange and black, when a figure materialized in the doorway, framed by the tempest. He was not a man from the town. He was Cheyenne. The warrior stood tall despite the exhaustion that radiated from him. Rain plastered his black hair to his high cheekbones and darkened his buckskin clothing. He leaned heavily on the shattered shaft of a spear, a weapon that even in its broken state possessed a fearsome beauty. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his left side, a testament to a recent and violent encounter. Elias's hand instinctively went to the heavy forging hammer that rested on the anvil. The ingrained caution of the frontier, the years of soldiering, the town's simmering hostility, it all screamed at him to drive the man away. But the warrior did not move, he did not speak. His eyes, dark and deep, met Elias's. There was no plea in them, no threat. There was only a profound weariness and a look of loss so sharp and familiar that it struck a chord deep within Elias's own hollowed-out chest. The man's gaze kept shifting from Elias's face to the broken spear in his hand. The weapon's head, a formidable piece of sharpened steel, was snapped cleanly from the fire-hardened ashwood. The shaft itself was covered in intricate carvings and beadwork, a history etched into its grain. Elias saw it then. The man wasn't just mourning a broken weapon, he was mourning a part of himself. It was the same desolate look Elias saw in his own reflection on the surface of the quenching trough on quiet mornings. The blacksmith's calloused fingers loosened their grip on the hammer. He was so tired of fighting, tired of the walls, tired of the ghosts. With a heavy sigh that seemed to pull up years of dust from his lungs, he gave a short, sharp nod toward the dry space near the forge. It was not an invitation of warmth, but a reluctant concession, an acknowledgement of a shared language of broken things. The warrior Vokin stepped inside, his moccasins silent on the hard-packed dirt floor. He moved with a grace that even injury could not entirely steal. The smithy, which had always felt like a tomb, now held a second living, breathing soul, and the air crackled with a tension thicker than the storm outside. Elias gestured towards a low stool. Vokin lowered himself onto it carefully, his breath hissing through his teeth as the movement pulled at the gash in his side. He never took his eyes off Elias. Communication was a bridge built of gestures and intent. Elias pointed to the wound. Vokin nodded, his face a mask of stoicism. Elias went to a small wooden chest where he kept his meager supplies. He brought back a bottle of carbolic acid, clean rags, and a needle threaded with gut. He did not ask for permission. He simply knelt and began to clean the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were instruments of force. Vokin sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the forge. He did not flinch when the acid stung, or when the needle pierced his skin, stitching the torn flesh back together. Elias worked with a focused, detached efficiency, the same he applied to mending a crack in a bell. It was a problem to be solved, a piece of broken material to be made whole again. When the wound was dressed, a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the whisper of the wind. Vokin finally held out the broken spear. He offered it not as a customer, but as a supplicant, laying a sacred relic upon an altar. Elias took the two pieces, his hands feeling the weight and balance of what it once was. The spearhead was masterfully forged, but not by a white man. The steel had a different temper, a pattern in the metal he hadn't seen before. The ash shaft was smooth with use, its surface a canvas of stories. Elias could make out the shapes of buffalo, of eagles, of a running wolf, and what looked like the figures of a woman and a child. A life story. Elias ran a thumb over the carving of the child, and for a fleeting, painful moment, he saw Samuel's face. He looked up and met Vokin's eyes. The warrior's gaze flickered to Elias's leg, the one that always favored his weight, and then back to his face. There was no pity in the look, only a quiet, stark understanding. In that moment, they were not white man and Indian, not former soldier and warrior. They were just two men, marked by the world, each carrying the weight of their own history. Elias turned to the forge without a word. He thrust the bellows handle down, and the embers awoke with a hungry roar, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He would not just fix this spear. He would reforge it. The task took on a life of its own, becoming more than a simple repair. It became an act of respect, a conversation between two craftsmen across a cultural divide. Elias examined the snapped tang, the point where the metal had been seated in the wood. A simple weld would be weak, a crude patch on a fine instrument. It demanded more. He worked through the night, the storm his orchestra, the fire his sun. He carefully heated the spearhead, not to a brilliant white heat that would ruin its temper, but to a glowing cherry red. He drew out the broken tang, hammering it, folding it, shaping it into a new, longer, stronger socket that would cradle the wood. The rhythm of his work was a prayer he had forgotten he knew. Heat, hammer, shape. Heat, hammer, shape. It was the only language he was fluent in, the only truth he had left. And Vokin watched. He did not sleep. He sat on the stool, a silent sentinel, his presence a strange comfort. He watched the fire breathe. He watched the muscles in Elias's arms and back move with practiced power. He watched the sparks fly like fleeting stars in the dark smithy. In his focused gaze, Elias felt something he had not felt in years. Seen. His craft, the one thing he had poured all his brokenness into, was being witnessed not as a mere service, but as a ceremony. As the hours wore on, the tension in the room began to soften, like iron in the heat. Sometime after midnight, Vokin reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of dried meat and a piece of hard, crumbly bread. He held them out to Elias. It was a simple offering, but it felt as significant as a treaty. Elias paused, his face slick with sweat, and wiped his hands on his leather apron. He took the food and ate, the salt of the meat sharp and real on his tongue. They shared the meager meal in silence, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared labor and mutual respect hanging between them. Elias finished the metalwork as the first hint of dawn began to gray the edges of the night. The new socket was a thing of dark, brutal beauty, seamless and strong. He then turned his attention to the wood, carefully fitting the shaft, securing it with a wrapping of wet rawhide that would shrink as it dried, binding wood and steel together as if they had never been parted. It was stronger now than it had been before. He held it for a moment, feeling its renewed power, its unbroken spirit. Then he turned and presented it to Vokin. The warrior took it, his hands tracing the lines of the new work. He tested its weight, its balance. He ran a finger over the smooth, dark metal of the socket where it met the carved wood. He looked from the spear to Elias, and his face, which had been a mask of stoic control all night, softened with an expression of profound, unshielded gratitude. Vokin reached for another pouch at his hip, this one ornately decorated with blue and white beads. He held it out, an offer of payment. Elias looked at the pouch, then at the mended spear, then at the man holding it. Something inside him, a long frozen river, began to thaw. This night had not been a transaction. It had been something else, something quieter and more significant. To accept payment would be to diminish it, to turn it back into a simple job. He shook his head, a small, firm gesture. "No," he said, the word rough from disuse. He tapped his own chest. "No charge." Vokin paused, his eyes searching Elias's face, seeking to understand the nature of this refusal. He saw no pity, no condescension. He saw only a strange and quiet honor. After a long moment, the warrior nodded slowly. He rose from the stool, his movements still stiff from his injury, but his stature restored by the whole spear in his hand. With a final, lingering look at Elias, a look that conveyed more than words ever could, he turned and slipped out of the smithy, disappearing into the pale, rain-washed light of the new day. Elias stood alone, the silence of the forge returning, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty, it was filled with the echo of a shared vigil. He felt an exhaustion deeper than any he had known from labor, but it was clean, honest fatigue. He had mended a broken thing, and in doing so, he felt a hairline crack in his own soul begin to seal. He had no idea that the ripples from his small act of free labor were already spreading, and that they would return to his shore as a tidal wave. The morning passed in a haze of weariness. Elias cleaned his tools and swept the smithy, the familiar motions a comfort. It was just past noon when the sound began, a low rumble from the town that grew into a nervous buzz. He stepped to the doorway and looked toward Providence. People were gathering in the street, pointing, their faces tight with anxiety. He followed their gaze to the east, and his blood ran cold. A column of riders was approaching. They were not soldiers, they were warriors, 7 of them, riding with a slow, deliberate purpose that was more intimidating than any charge. Each man was dressed in the formal regalia of his station, their feather bonnets and decorated war shirts a brilliant, terrifying splash of color against the drab prairie. Even from this distance, Elias could feel the weight of their authority. Before he could fully process the sight, a group of men burst from the town and hurried towards his forge. At their lead was Sheriff Callahan, a man whose authority was derived more from his loud voice and his badge than from any innate courage. His face was pale and blotchy with fear and anger. "Blackwood," Callahan shouted, his voice tight. "We saw him. The whole town saw that Cheyenne leave your forge at dawn." The men behind him muttered in agreement, their eyes darting from Elias to the approaching chiefs, then back again, filled with accusation. "What did you do, Blackwood?" the sheriff demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "What devil's bargain did you make with them? Are you a traitor?" Elias looked at their frightened, angry faces. He saw the same prejudice and fear that had festered in this town since its founding. He felt the old walls inside him begin to rise again, the familiar impulse to retreat into surly silence. But the memory of the night, of the shared respect in the firelight, held him back. "I fixed a broken spear," Elias said, his voice level. "Fixed his spear?" One of the townsmen scoffed. "You armed him, and now look, they're coming for us." Panic was starting to curdle into a mob mentality. But their fear was eclipsed by a greater one. The 7 chiefs did not ride to the center of Providence. They rode directly to the smithy, their ponies stopping in a line before the open doors, creating a formidable barrier between Elias and the townsmen. The air grew thick and still. Sheriff Callahan and his posse were frozen, trapped between their suspect and the very source of their terror. The chiefs dismounted with a fluid, unified grace. They were men of power, their faces weathered maps of wisdom and war. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. Elias stood his ground in the doorway of his forge, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, uncertain anticipation. One of the chiefs, an older man with a face of noble gravity and streaks of silver in his long black hair, stepped forward. He wore the insignia of a Lakota leader. He surveyed the scene, the terrified townsman, the bristling sheriff, and finally, Elias, standing alone in the shadows of his forge. The chief's eyes met Elias's. "You are the one they call Blackwood?" he asked. His English was clear, measured, and carried an undeniable authority. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. "I am." Sheriff Callahan, finding a sliver of courage, stepped forward. "I am the law in this town, Chief Tashunka. If you have business here, you speak to me." Tashunka did not even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on Elias. "We have not come for the man who wears a tin star," the chief said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "We have come to speak with the man who works with iron and honor." The gathered townsfolk murmured in confusion. This was not the attack they had expected. "The warrior who came to you last night," Tashunka continued, "his name is Vokin. He is a great leader of the Cheyenne, and he is husband to my daughter. He came to you in need." Elias simply nodded, waiting. "The spear you mended was not just a weapon," Tashunka explained, his voice taking on a new resonance, a tone of history and reverence. "It is the Wotai, the spirit spear of his clan. It has been passed from father to son for more generations than this town has stood for years. It is a part of our story, a piece of our soul." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Vokin broke the spear, saving our winter camp from a great bear that had gone mad with hunger. He saved the lives of women and children, but in his victory, the spear was broken. It was an act of great courage, but it brought him great shame. A man cannot lead his people with a broken spirit." Tashunka took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over Elias, taking in the worn leather apron, the soot-stained hands, the weary lines on his face. "He told us what happened here. He said you tended his wound without question. He said you looked upon the spirit spear not as a savage's tool, but with the eyes of a true craftsman. He watched you work through the night, giving the spear a strength it did not have before. You did not just patch it, you made it whole again." The chief's gaze was intense, searching, and when it was done, he said, his voice dropping slightly, "You refused his payment. You asked for nothing in return for your skill, your fire, your time." Elias felt the eyes of every manchief and townsman alike upon him. He felt exposed, his simple private act laid bare for all to see. He could only stand his ground and meet the chief's gaze. "An act of honor for its own sake is a rare thing in this world," Tashunka declared, his voice rising so that all could hear. "My treaty partners in the fort would demand 100 horses for such a service and still call it a favor. You, a man we thought was our enemy, showed a deeper understanding of respect than those who swear oaths of friendship. You did not see a Cheyenne. You saw a man with a broken treasure, and you mended it." He turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging the stunned sheriff and the silent crowd. "We did not ride here for war. War is for broken men. We rode here to see the man who understands that a kindness given without condition builds a stronger bridge than any treaty." Tashunka gestured to one of the other chiefs, who stepped forward carrying a large, carefully folded bundle wrapped in tanned hide. He presented it to the Lakota leader. "You have shown our people a great honor, Elias Blackwood," Tashunka said, his voice now gentle. "And honor must be met with honor. We bring you this gift, a symbol of peace from the 7 tribes, a sign that we recognize you as a man of true spirit." With a powerful and fluid motion, he and the other chief unfurled the bundle. It was a magnificent white buffalo robe, a sacred object of immense spiritual significance and rarity. The hide was creamy white, soft as winter snow, and its presence seemed to sanctify the dusty ground before the smithy. It was a gift beyond price, a gesture of profound respect that silenced every whisper, every doubt. Elias stared at the robe, then at the 7 solemn faces of the chiefs. He looked past them, at the shocked and bewildered faces of the people of Providence. Their world of simple hatreds and clear-cut enemies had just been irrevocably complicated. They had seen a traitor consorting with the enemy. The chiefs had seen a man of peace building a bridge. In that moment, the forge, Elias's refuge from the world, had become the very center of it. He slowly, reverently, reached out and took the robe. Its weight was real, substantial in his hands. It was the heaviest and the lightest thing he had ever held. He looked at Tashunka and managed a single profound word. "Thank you." The chiefs departed as they had arrived, with a quiet and immense dignity. They mounted their ponies and rode back toward the open plains, leaving behind a stunned town and a lone blacksmith standing in his doorway, holding a symbol of peace. The silence that descended in their wake was different from the one that had come before. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe. Elias was left with the robe, a tangible testament to the night's strange magic. He carefully folded the sacred hide and brought it inside, laying it over the old wooden chest that held the few mementos he had of Clara and Samuel. The white of the robe seemed to glow in the dim light of the smithy, a beacon of peace in a room that had for so long been a shrine to his pain. The air no longer felt stale with loneliness. It felt clean, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust. In the days that followed, the town of Providence changed, or rather, its perception of Elias Blackwood changed. The fear and suspicion were replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. He was no longer the surly, broken recluse. He was the man the chiefs came to see. People spoke to him differently. They met his eyes in the street. Their requests for work were couched in a new deference. Sheriff Callahan avoided him entirely, unable to reconcile the blacksmith he thought he knew with the man honored by the 7 tribes. Elias did not change his ways. He remained a man of few words, dedicated to his forge, but the isolation had been breached. The walls around his heart, while still there, now had a gate. Sometimes he would find a gift left silently at his door, a brace of rabbits, a bundle of sage, a finely woven basket of wild berries. There were never any words, just the quiet, ongoing acknowledgement from a people who understood that respect was a currency far more valuable than coin. Weeks later, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the prairie, Elias stood at his anvil. He heated a piece of iron, the familiar glow, a comforting presence. The rhythmic clang of his hammer was no longer a sound of lonely penance. It was the sound of a man at work, a man with a place in the world. His gaze fell upon the white buffalo robe, draped in a place of honor. He had learned that a single act of kindness, offered without expectation, could ripple outwards in ways one could never predict. It could mend more than just a broken spear. It could mend the fractures between peoples, challenge the certainties of hatred, and even begin to heal the deepest cracks in a broken human heart. He was still Elias Blackwood, blacksmith. But he was no longer a man defined solely by his ghosts. The fire in his forge no longer just burned away the past. It now forged a future, one piece of glowing, hopeful iron at a time.